Welcome to my ranking video, ranking Led Zeppelin, the catalog of Led Zeppelin. To some people, probably the greatest band of all time. Not to me. People who know my channel know I'm a huge Beatles fan. And I've got a kind of special relationship with Led Zeppelin. My father was the biggest Led Zeppelin fan in the world, I guess. It was his favorite band, and when he died like 10 years ago, I inherited the albums. So I guess some of the albums, those are all original pressings from the 70s. Maybe some of those albums would be very valuable these days, but I guess they're not, because my father, as I said, was such a huge fan. He played them non-stop, so they're not in mint or near mint, or not even very good condition, some of them. And he even wrote the initials on some of the albums. He wrote his initials on it. So like in the 70s there was no Discogs, and I never sell records anyway, so that's not something I think about. It's great that I have the albums, and it's a kind of a memory of my father. And my mother always joked that Led Zeppelin were the reason for their divorce. When I was like 10 years old, they divorced because she couldn't stand how often he played them and how loud he played them. So in a kind of very literal way, I grew up with them. I was kind of forced to them. So that's maybe why I'm not the biggest fan, and I'm not often listening to them, because I was kind of force-fed with them. But still, I have to agree with my father that they were one of the most important bands of all time, one of the biggest bands of the 70s, and there's lots of great stuff there if you're into rock and roll music, which I am. So I've got this, I come from two angles here, a love-hate relationship in a way. So that's why I'm going to warn you, like if you watch ranking Led Zeppelin videos, they're mostly done by people who adore them, and they never did anything wrong, and each album is a masterpiece. I'm not one of those people to say. So let's go in. I've just showed you this album. I won't rank this because this is the live album. The song remains the same. Very good live album. I wouldn't say at the height of their powers. It was from the mid-70s, so it was from when they were at their best live. But I think the band themselves, they were never that satisfied with that show that was recorded for this live record, which was also a movie with some strange psychedelic surreal scenes that they shot for the movie. The movie overall, if you're a fan especially, is quite entertaining, and the show is very good. But I think Led Zeppelin themselves always thought they could do better than the live performance at Madison Square Garden for this concert. I think Jimmy Page recovers from a broken hand or something like that. Whatever. But very good live album. So at the bottom, I have to look, the number is 9, so 9, we're going to rank 9 albums. Presence. I never liked that album. I never, apart from the time when my father played it to us, I never really listened much to it. People say that Achilles' Last Stand is a classic. I would say if Achilles' Last Stand would be a song on Houses of the Holy or Led Zeppelin IV, it wouldn't be seen as a classic. It would just be one of the songs on that album. But since it stands out as probably the best song on that album, that's why people say it's a classic. It can't save the album for me, and it's not that great of a track to me. And the album, the production is a bit. It's a weird production. It's the album. It's always said that it's a kind of reaction from Led Zeppelin to punk rock. It came out in, I think, early 77, but must have been recorded in 76. And it was also the time when Robert Plant, after his car accident, when he still recovered from that, it's a weird album. They try to be punky on that album, but it's not really in there. They're not really good at doing that kind of music, I think. Number 8 is also kind of a weak release. But it's not their fault in that sense, because it's Coda from 1982. It's, as by the year it was released, you can tell it was released after they split up. After John Bonham died in 1980, they split up. That was, I think, a good decision, a respectful decision also. But Coda is like the leftovers, outtakes, songs that weren't released, and it's alright. It's good to round it up, to round the career up, the recording career. But what the title says. It's a Coda, nothing more, nothing less, nothing special to me, I'm afraid. Number 7 is the first album. I'd say it's an interesting album, but I wouldn't say it's a good album. It's In Through the Outdoor. I could take it out of the paper thing. In Through the Outdoor from 1979, so it's the last album when they were together, the last album they really recorded together as a group and released as a group in 79. And it's interesting because on this album they had to experiment with stuff. I say they had to, because this was in the midst of when Jimmy Page was very deep into heroin, and he wasn't really functioning, and he was the de facto leader, main songwriter, producer of the group, but he couldn't really give it 100%. He probably couldn't even give it a 50%. So John Paul Jones took charge. I really like John Paul Jones, the most underrated member of the group. I always liked his ideas, his stuff. He was on the albums before, and he's like in charge of the whole thing. And the songs I like most on that album are the more, the weirder, the more experimental songs. The songs where Jimmy Page doesn't really do much. Songs like All My Love and Fool in the Rain, where they're experimenting with pianos and even strings, ballad strings on All My Love, but I think those are probably synthy strings. But it's a great song. I think Robert Plant wrote the lyrics to All My Love to commemorate his son who died shortly before they started producing that album. So very tragic, tumultuous time in the career of Led Zeppelin, and you can hear it. It's not really a cohesive group effort, but interesting album. Not brilliant in my opinion, but it's good. I would say it's a good album. The next album is the first album I would say is a very good album. It's the debut album. Great album. It's one of 2 60s albums by Led Zeppelin, released in early '69. At that time, Led Zeppelin often were accused of stealing songs, plagiarizing songs. This is most evident on this album. I think many of the songs, if not all songs, are credited to either Jimmy Page or Page Bonham, Page Jones, Page Bland. But most of those songs are based on songs are almost covers. But I think what the critics who condemn this practice by Led Zeppelin often oversee is that Led Zeppelin saw themselves in the blues tradition, and blues was always about taking something that someone else has done and hopefully bringing it to the next level, and they achieved that with that album. So it's that's how I feel about the plagiarizing. But some great recordings on this album: Good Times, Bad Times, Babe I'm Gonna Leave You. Wow, I really love Babe I'm Gonna Leave You, their version of it. And Communication Breakdown is almost a proto-punk thing. I said on Presence they tried to sound punk. 9 years before Presence they nailed a punk song, but 9 years before punk happened. So this is probably the best punk song. It's not on Presence, it's on their first album. It's Communication Breakdown. Great. So this is the first great album, I would say. Next album is the folky album, Led Zeppelin III. It starts off with False Flag, with Immigrant Song, one of the most rocking songs, one of their most famous songs. But after that it's a very mellow album. When Led Zeppelin often, if you give them a label, most often you hear hard rock or classic hard rock, and sometimes this album, when this came out, I think they were seen as a blues rock band. This is the most bluesy album. Led Zeppelin II is probably when they were labeled as a hard rock group, but Record 3 is more of a mixed thing, and the folky stuff is most prominent. But Since I've Been Loving You, probably my favorite song on that album, is again not a folky song. So it starts the tradition of, various styles, combining many styles. I think you can't say Led Zeppelin are a hard rock band or a blues rock band or a folk band. There are all those things, and that's one of the reasons that make this band so great. That they were more willing to experiment than especially the other big two hard rock bands in that era were the biggest drivers, so to speak, were Deep Purple and Black Sabbath. Those groups also had songs or albums where they experimented with the formula, but Led Zeppelin, they were the group that wanted to branch out into different styles the most, and Led Zeppelin III is a good example with this folky stuff. Great folk songs on that album, Tangerine and things like that. But Since I've Been Loving You is my favorite track, and Immigrant Song is my second favorite track, so the non-folky songs. But very good album. But not yet a masterpiece in my opinion, which is, I think, a controversial thing to say on YouTube, because there's so many Led Zeppelin diehard fans on YouTube. My next album is, this is an album many people say it's one of the best albums, if not the best album of all time, or at least of the 70s. But I also think it's not yet a masterpiece, but it's a very, very, very good album. It's an excellent album. But Led Zeppelin IV, their most famous album, their most successful album, of course, Stairway to Heaven. And when I look at watching videos or talk to Led Zeppelin fans, I completely disagree with them, but because it's a hip thing amongst Led Zeppelin fans to say, yeah, Stairway to Heaven is not my favorite track on the album. It's overplayed and it's overrated, but the rest of the album is such a masterpiece. I think it's the other way around. I think Stairway to Heaven is probably their best song. There's a reason why it's the most famous song. This is a great song, of course, but the rest is not as good to me. I was never a fan of Black Dog and Rock and Roll. They start the album and they're seen as classics, but I was never too much of a fan of those. And then the Levee Breaks, very also seen as a classic. I was never into When the Levee Breaks, I have to say. But the rest, again, the songs that I haven't mentioned yet are more in this folky style of Led Zeppelin III, and I like those. So I think Stairway to Heaven is a magnificent masterpiece of a song. The folky songs are great, and the other three rock songs are a bit overrated, but are good to very good, I would say. So, but from now on, the top three, those are the masterpieces in my opinion. Those are the albums that I really like, that my father couldn't make me hate them. I have to agree with him, those are masterpieces. I don't know if those are his favorite albums, but those are my favorite albums. I think he thinks that each album by them is a masterpiece. Houses of the Holy, I think this is probably the most overrated album, and this is the most underrated album. Houses of the Holy, on any other day it could have been my number 2 or maybe even number 1 album. This is a brilliant album, and this is from 1973, so it's the album after Led Zeppelin IV. And the first 4 albums, like I said, they always try to experiment with styles, even on the first 4 albums. But here it really gets wild. Here it really gets like a kaleidoscope of sounds and textures and different styles. And I have to go through the track list. I think there's not one, each song brings something else to the table. The song remains the same. The song remains the same, which is classic hard rock song, but one of the best, I think, one of the most underrated classic hard rock songs. Then the grunge is a strange, a funk song, attempted funk. Jamaica, reggae, it was panned at the time, so it's a very heavy-handed reggae song. But they aren't Bob Marley and the Wailers. They're going to do it in their own style, and so that makes it unique. That only Led Zeppelin could have made a reggae song like that, and I like that song. I think it's funny. No Quarter, one of my favorite Led Zeppelin songs of all time. Very mysterious, very psychedelic, and the ocean at the end, again, hard rock. Like on Led Zeppelin II or something. And speaking of Led Zeppelin II, my second favorite Led Zeppelin album is Led Zeppelin II. This I would say is the most classic hard rock album, although there are folky songs like Thank You on there. Um, but this is, puts it on another level. Led Zeppelin 1 was great, but here they become, Led Zeppelin. Like I said on the first album, they take so much inspiration from things that happened before, and it was like, when Led Zeppelin started, they were called New Yardbirds because Jimmy Page formed them out of the Yardbirds, and Led Zeppelin 1 is almost a transitional, is it a late period Yardbirds record or is it Led Zeppelin, but now it's Led Zeppelin. Now they found their sounds, they found the way of doing things. Whole Lotta Love, probably the best hard rock riff based song, one of the best ever done by anyone in that style. But Heartbreaker even almost as good as Whole Lotta Love. And the songs that, like I said, where they are branching out, where it's not classic hard rock, are all highlights, like Thank You, What Is and What Should Never Be, Ramble On, and the bluesy Bring It On Home, when it really starts, when it starts to rock, Bring It On Home, it's one of the best. I could live without Moby Dick. I'm not into 10-minute drum solos. On the studio version it's not 10 minutes, but live it was often more than 10 minutes. I'm not into these. The right length for a drum solo is the Beatles in the End, which lasts for like 10 seconds, and which is, even I could play that solo. It's that simple. I'm not into technical proggy stuff. So that's not what I like. Without songs like Lemon Song and Moby Dick, maybe this would be my #1 album. But there can only be one #1 album. Here I would agree with Led Zeppelin fans and with my father. This album is one of the best albums of the 70s, and one of the best rock albums overall of all time, and one of the best double albums of all time. Physical Graffiti. What an album, this is a perfect album. This is in a way their most experimental album, trying out different kinds of sounds and styles, but it's also their most classic album. People always say Led Zeppelin IV is their most classic album, but like I said, 3 or 4 songs on that album are just acoustic folky songs, and the Rock and Roll Black Dog, if that's not your type of Led Zeppelin, then it's, then there are only 2 tracks left on that album. But this is, classic Led Zeppelin sound, like on Kashmir. Kashmir is a great example for a song that is classic Led Zeppelin with that riff, but also at the same time tries out stuff that bands like Black Sabbath or Deep Purple probably wouldn't have done. I know Deep Purple also experimented and were like a jazz rock influenced band, but to me the jazzy stuff by Deep Purple was never what defined the group. They were more like a play fast riffs and solos, electric group. To me, that was where they were at the best. But Led Zeppelin were at their best at almost everything they tried, at least in this phase of their career, mid-70s, which was, in my opinion, their best phase. You can see by the ranking of the albums, by the positions, that I think that the second half of their career, they only made 2 albums when they were together, and 3 albums in general in the later half of the 70s, and those I don't like. I think if they split up in 1976 or 75 after they released this album, they don't need to be even bigger than they are, because they are already one of the big groups of all time, but they would be so much bigger. Then they would probably, I hate to say that, but then they would probably rival the Beatles in terms of who had the most perfect run of albums and the most perfect kind of career. So if they split up after Physical Graffiti, they would have split up, in my opinion, with the biggest masterpiece, and they wouldn't have done all those, I wouldn't say awful, but compared to the stuff before, poor stuff that they did with Presence and Info the Outdoor, Coda. That was my ranking, I guess, kind of controversial ranking of Led Zeppelin. Still great band, and Robert Plant still a great guy. I think I like just listening to him when he's doing interviews, and he's a great elder statesman of rock these days, and I think he has an interesting solo career. I'm not really a fan of the things he does, but at least he's trying something. He's not repeating a formula, and that I respect that. And yeah, so I think Robert Plant and John Paul Jones, again controversial. Robert Plant and John Paul Jones are probably my two favorite members of the group. Like I said, I'm not into those long drum solos, and I think I can see that John Bonham was one of the best rock drummers of all time, but it wasn't my kind of rock drumming. I think Keith Richards once said it quite well, why he doesn't like John Bonham's style that much, because it doesn't really swing, it doesn't really roll, it's only rocking, but it doesn't roll. I'm more of that, you know, I have more the 60s Ringo Starr, Charlie Watts approach to drumming probably. And Jimmy Page, of course, kind of genius, at least in you know, at stealing stuff and making it his own, and great producer in the 70s. But like I said, Plant and Jones are my two favorite members. You know, those are probably, I'm more of a pop guy, and those are the members that you gravitate to if you're more like a Beatles fan, I guess. So that was my ranking of Led Zeppelin. Thank you very much for watching.